The gaudiness of the Minecraft trailers definitely set you up to believe that the blend of live action and CG was going to look far more incomplete than it actually does. But the realization of Minecraft's overworld is pretty seamless. I can never accuse the effects team of not fully committing to blending the actors into the surrounding landscape. They go above and beyond, honestly, as even I know that the video game's actual effects are far less concerned than the film is with emulating naturalistic textures. And while I will never stop wishing that CG artists were allowed more creative license to make more unwieldy and blatantly artificial environments, like 2008 Speed Racer for example, rather than being contracted to make their designs as photorealistic as possible, more people than ever are apparently concerned that nothing but total fidelity to realism will allow audiences to believe that Jack Black really is dancing with video game pandas. So to that effect, the team behind a Minecraft movie have done a great job. And yet, even with the setting perfectly blended around the actor, something definitely kills the illusion. I found myself flashing back to Mary Poppins' famous trip through the street painting, where Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke not only walked through a chalk-drawn park, but danced with traditionally Disney-animated 2D penguins. It's a far less realistically blended scene than any in Minecraft, and yet more immersive. Why? Well, the comparative dancing in each film is the tip-off. Andrews and Van Dyke aren't just convincingly interacting with characters they can't actually see, they move about as if they're in an open space. The camera follows them in a fashion reminiscent of any fully live-action musical released at the time. Jack Black, meanwhile, stands dead center frame, busting out his usual Tenacious D moves while the pandas jive anywhere else in the scene behind him. Everything about Jack Black's moves, his blocking, and the stationary camera communicates that he's dancing in a limited, empty space and just told to dance, they'll take care of everything else in post. It's the kind of attitude and energy that flows through the entire runtime, but especially in Black's opening narration, that really glides through a lot of details concerning his character and the main plot, which definitely feels like it's going for a Lego Movie feel, part action-adventure parody, part meta-narrative on creativity, but with every detail glossed over, its general apathy for the familiarity of its story standing in for jokes, it always feels just one step short of actually being a parody. For example, casting Jack Black as the Alan Parrish type, immersed in the game world for years to the point that he's the expert on how the world works and can do basically anything with ease, next to Jason Momoa as a washed-up video game nerd trying to look more impressive and important than he is, I'm pretty certain that's meant to be a joke. But so little is done with it that whoever suggested it can't really have believed it had any potential beyond the first shot of Black and Momoa face to face in their against-type roles. For a story purportedly about creativity, it's mostly hampered by precisely this first idea will do mentality, especially the character journeys. Emma Myers and Sebastian Hansen as the siblings being forced to grow up too quickly, Daniel Brooks as the struggling real estate agent forced to hold down multiple jobs, Momoa on the verge of losing his business and Jack believing that the real world has nothing to offer him that the overworld can't. All compelling setups, but are they ever paid off? When the time comes for everything to wrap up, have any of these descriptions changed? Momoa's less up himself, the siblings establish that they love each other, although I don't think that was ever in question. Everybody's happy endings, again, give the impression that this film was meant to be way more of a parody, and generally anarchic towards the traditional story beats than it actually was. Hansen's conclusion is that he finally got his jetpack working. That should be delightfully absurd, but it's practically delivered with a sigh. Quirky premise aside, this is definitely a more conventional film than the usual A24 this'll definitely be a cult hit in 5 years' time production, perhaps spurred on by the more mainstream success of Everything Everywhere All at Once and Civil War. Taking the classic purity-coded image of the unicorn and tracing its origins to medieval tapestries depicting their entrapment, Death of the Unicorn offers the fun spin that the creatures are also bloodthirsty beasts when crossed, leading to a fun bestial revenge slasher against the greedy, resource-exploiting humans defiling the corpse of a unicorn foal for their own gain. The focus on making the film a fun romp means that there's not an awful lot to dissect from the narrative beyond the basic declaration of animal abuse and experimentation equals bad and greed equals bad. Its depiction of the fraudulent philanthropists feeling like a modern twist on the evil oil barons or Lex Luthor, Gordon Gekko corporate tycoons, laughing maniacally over the filthy profits their newly seized assets will net them while arrogantly gloating about their superiority over mankind and Mother Nature. The main theme is one of family, with the central father-daughter duo of Elliot and Ridley, played by Paul Rudd and Jenna Ortega, fractured by the death of Ridley's mother and therefore serving as a stark contrast to the ultra-rich Leopolds, who show little love for one another and have seemingly no concept of real loss. As they take full ownership of the unicorn corpse that Elliot inadvertently ran over, inviting him to partner with them in this venture, Ridley questions whether her father is truly thinking of both of them or simply himself as he pursues his once-in-a-lifetime offer, and Elliot fails to realize that everything he ostensibly does for Ridley is driving her further from him. Greed is the enemy of family is a perfectly straight-laced theme to carry a fun, gore-fest comedy, and Paul Rudd and Jenna Ortega are an effortlessly relatable duo to carry it. Not to mention Richard E. Grant, Tia Leone, and Will Poulter work very well together as the wretchedly wealthy Leopolds. Although Elliot's characterization is a little at war between being totally in sync with the outlook of the Leopolds and simply misguided. Although that's likely the effect of Ridley being the true POV protagonist. Elliot's imprecise motivations reflecting Ridley's uncertainty over him. But it makes for a relatively underdeveloped feeling climax when it appears that following this extraordinary situation, nobody really appears to have changed in any way, shape, or form. Is it presumptuous to call Drop Christopher Landon's Hitchcock film, just because it's a suspense thriller about a normal person roped into a conspiracy, unable to reveal her predicament to anyone else as other people's lives are at risk? It certainly sports Hitchcock vibes, in the same way that Landon's classic slasher with a comedy twist films like Happy Death Day and Freaky made more than a few people think of Wes Craven. Similar to those, however, Drop isn't a direct homage. There's no clear references to his films, as far as I could see, and nothing about the way it's filmed calls to mind the head-spinning whirlwind of tension and anxiety of Vertigo, Psycho, or Rear Window. This is especially true to the build-up to Violet, played by Megan Fahey, receiving the data drops on her phone blackmailing her to murder the man she's on a date with, where little advantage is really taken of fully exploring the layout of the restaurant to spark a fire of speculation and paranoia around the setting and the dozens of unknowns filling it up in relation to her vantage point of the table she and Henry, played by Brandon Skemler, eventually sit at. We get some basic establishing shots as Violet enters, followed by some rather clinical, uncomfortably timed shot reverse shots of interaction between her and Henry, as well as a handful of other diners and employees who fill up the list of suspects. This isn't to say Landon is lacking in his own visual flourish, though. It just takes until Violet realizes the danger she, Henry, and her son are in, that the playfulness with sound and lighting comes into effect. And having Megan Fahey in the lead role as a domestic abuse survivor no less, instead of Brandon Scanlon or a Cary Grant Jimmy Stewart type, could definitely qualify as a subversion of the role usually expected of a Hitchcock blonde. Violet's present situation, trying to reach the next step of healing the wounds of the past by breaking out of the mental barrier of painting all men with the same brush as the late husband who caused her so much pain, offers a rather delectably sick spin to her role as the innocent thrown into this cruel, deadly game that seeks to use her as a pawn to harm other people. Her feelings only considered as far as they can be exploited, not dissimilarly from how many of the supporting Hitchcock blondes are appropriated into vessels of the desires of the various male leads and or villains. Sometimes intended in a purely flattering or romantic sense, like with Grace Kelly in Rear Window, but often in a much more damaged and egotistical manner, most famously with Kim Novak in Vertigo. All of this, of course, is still contingent on a very lightly signposted idea that Drop was created with Hitchcock at the forefront of the director's mind. Looking at it simply as an original thriller, Violet's history, desire to find closure with her demons, and current no-win scenario predicament still all coalesce to make her a very easy to root for heroine, something that Landon is developing an impressive track record for. The race to the finish is torn between feeling like an effectively escalated ramp-up of excitement from all the build-up, and a bit of a hasty rush to resolve all of the conflict, but I think that, regardless of how everything ends, the effectiveness of the build-up is so much more vital an aspect to generating an appropriate emotional response. It's an admittedly darker take on the adage that it's the journey, not the destination, no doubt, but applicable anyway. Nothing in The Amateur makes me speculate about the political leanings of the book it's based on, as much as what's left out of The Amateur. I refer to an early scene shared by Rami Malek's Charlie Heller and Rachel Brosnahan's Sarah Heller, featured in most of the trailers, but unless I phased out for a minute while watching, cut from the film itself. Sarah asks if Charlie ever wonders what the CIA does with all the information he digs up for them. Charlie responds, "It's the CIA. I've got to trust that they'll make the right call." Now, I haven't read anything about hasty reshoots or re-edits, so I'm sure its removal from the official release is more the result of a creative decision that a line like this maybe broadcasts a little too clearly that the agency Charlie works for and the terrorists he hunts to avenge his wife's death are in some way connected. But you can't help but speculate, given how often you hear about the military or the government getting twitchy about movies being too critical of their organization. Depictions of the military are the more regular outlets for propaganda, but it's hardly a coincidence that American spy films that feature homegrown agencies as the villains usually create a fictional department that's legally distinct from their real world counterparts. Whether there were any real intentions for the amateur to be a more scathing attack on the CIA or not, the finished film takes the have your cake and eat it too approach of the average cop drama or thriller, making sure that any examples of corruption is counterbalanced with assurances that those at the very top are still honor bound, virtuous, and will work to root out any bugs in the system when made aware of them. Perhaps it's Charlie's role as a cryptographer, as opposed to field agent, that sets up the idea that the theme of corruption could be taken to darker extremes. Then again, his alternative set of skills, from Lawrence Fishburne or John Berthel's more action hero characters, are mostly advertised as a unique spin on the typical spy action routine. Charlie will use brains, not brawn, to catch and kill the terrorists. And even that doesn't shake up the story as much as it has the potential to. Sure, Charlie avoids fights, shootouts, and car chases, but they still happen. That's not to say that they're not all slickly produced, they are, but it's not exactly a radical departure from other gritty 21st century spy films. I don't come out of any encounter with a villain thinking that Charlie handled himself in a way that any other secret agent protagonist wouldn't have. And this goes for Charlie's perspective on the muddy morality of his employer, too. There's a momentary bit of intrigue when he first discovers real evidence of foul play within the CIA's ranks, and his reaction is one of indifference. But seeing as at this point he's laser focused on his revenge quest, it's unlikely that this was meant to be a statement of his own lack of moral compass, or how having no qualms on this kind of corruption makes him perfect for the role he's in. The more it's revealed that the conspiracy goes deeper than Charlie initially anticipated, his goal remains unaffected. Succeed or fail, the conflict within him centers on whether his pursuit will end in revenge or justice. And the definition of justice always frames the organization he works for as clean, just in need of a little spring cleaning. Ryan Coogler talked about different film strips for 10 minutes, and I just knew I had to see the IMAX 70mm screening. It was an unforgettable experience, not just for Ryan Coogler's introductory interview, but for delivering on the classic communal theatrical experience he hoped to deliver. A rarer thing nowadays, but still something I've had before. But in a screen as grand as the BFI IMAX, seeing a film with clear affection for the in-cinemascope or VistaVision features of the 50s and 60s, it couldn't help but feel like a sensation from a bygone age. And for all the technicalities of the filmmaking, the scope, and the jam-packed screen, all of that would fall flat if not for the energy of Sinners itself, a riotous merging of musical rebellion and social liberation. Michael B. Jordan leads as twins Smoke and Stack, ex-soldiers and gangsters who open a juke joint in their Oakland hometown, inviting half the town to leave all their earthly concerns behind for a night of raucous music, drinking, and dancing. The supernatural element of the story, led by the utterly satanic Jack O'Connell, is ushered in by the outright spiritual nature of the blues music performed by Miles Catt and Sammy. The first half of Sinners, which takes its time to build up to the night of the juke joint, almost makes you bemoan the arrival of O'Connell's demonic entity, because the natural drama of this ensemble cast living their lives in the Jim Crow South is more than enough to carry the film. Watching Smoke and Stack return from Chicago and visit everyone from their old stomping ground, most of them scraping by day to day, all the while aware of the lingering presence of the Ku Klux Klan, and others, such as Sammy, dreaming of an escape to better prospects, only for those dreams to be quashed by the reports from the twins that the cities are hardly any different. Every scene and every new character met is just another addition to an embarrassment of dramatic riches, and more than suffices in building up to the sheer ecstasy of the blues-soaked night at the juke joint. But it's also the music and the part it plays in the narrative that makes the supernatural element yet another welcome addition. A lot is made of the true origins of the blues music, as well as its deep connection to the past and its undeniable influence on so much that followed, especially in one particular surreal instance during Sammy's performance, signifying the real nature of the so-called rock and roll spirit that the progenitors of these genres embodied. Sammy is the son of a preacher who, pretty typically for a dedicated member of the church, condemns his son's musical leanings as a form of consorting with the devil. It's a familiar conservative attack on burgeoning musical movements popular with younger generations in pretty much any era, with a common reaction being an embracing of the label devil worshippers. The dual threats of the out-of-this-world bad guys and the bigoted hordes of the Klan, less seen than the otherworldly monsters but an ever-present concern, gets to the heart of what embracing the devil truly means. The value of not bowing to the definitions of humanity, purity, and good given by institutions that condemn you from birth. Of accepting that if whatever you do, regardless of intent, fits their qualification of evil, the only choice is to declare what you are with pride. O'Connell's Remick, a much more literal embodiment of satanic evil than anything declared by the church or the state, stands as the proof that every one of the titular sinners, regardless of what moral codes they live by, have done so to survive, to live and to live as freely as they can, and an intent such as that can never genuinely be compared to selling your soul. It's as loud and proud as an ode to the strength of the human spirit gets. Two quotes have been bandied about a lot in the wake of Warfare's release. Steven Spielberg's that every war movie, good or bad, is an anti-war movie, and Francois Truffaut's that every film about war ends up being pro-war. Now, if I had to choose which one I agreed with, I'd probably argue that there's greater evidence to support the latter. But ultimately, when left alone, neither statement really interrogates the nature of any war movie individually or as a genre. Admittedly, I should locate the original source for these quotes, just to see if either director elaborated further. Geography, perspective, time period, political affiliation, all of these are details that I think should be taken in equal, if not greater consideration, as whether or not a portrayal of war is consciously or unconsciously advocating for war as a necessity. Whether you're in favour of Spielberg's perspective or Truffaut's, assuming you agree with either of them, both positions label every war film ever made as propaganda. When all the above-mentioned criteria is also taken into account, you have a clearer idea about what kind of warfare each piece of propaganda is trying to sell you on. Without these considerations, there's a risk of reducing the summary of every war ever fought as something that every participant shares equal blame for, regardless of preceding history, power imbalance, who was the invaded and who was the invader, etc., etc. I don't know how hopeful I was that Alex Garland would be conscious of all this when directing his own war film. I'd have been 100% confident that such a film from him would be incredibly nuanced any time before last year, but after Civil War proved to be a confessional from Garland about how jaded he's become with the idea that his work has any impact on anything he's commented upon, as told through the perspective of Kirsten Dunst's famous photojournalist, drifting through the latest war on autopilot and waiting for the day she's bumped off and replaced with zero fanfare, I started to worry that any future films from Garland would fully cement his giving up on offering any kind of insight. With this in mind, the opening text establishing warfare as being based on the collective memories of the soldiers depicted in the film is not there to caution you that everything you're about to watch could be massively skewed by perspective. No, much like the sound being stripped of all non-diegetic music for the whole runtime, this is meant to sell you on the realness of everything happening, to make you trust that you're being treated to a first-hand account of the war in Iraq. How this differentiates itself from any other American film about 21st century US military operations is a complete mystery. The soldiers' perspective on the war they're fighting and their presence in this country? No comment. All dialogue is centered on them doing their jobs, so you're left to assume that their only thoughts on this matter is we're just doing our job. When the shit hits the fan, some of them are shown to be distressed, not so much that it prevents them from doing their jobs, aside from the ones whose legs are irreparably damaged by explosives, their reactions to which are perfectly relatable. I doubt I'd be any calmer if it happened to me. The colouring of their actions towards Iraqi people? Well, any fighting they engage in is initiated by jihadists who get no lines or close-up screen time, meaning they can only be seen as the enemy combatants. The family whose home is commandeered by the SEALs are allowed to be shown as distressed and critical of their presence, but as the soldiers' only response to this are civil and business-like apologies for the inconvenience, it is again framed as just doing our jobs can't be helped. That it's typical of war films as US military propaganda, in the sense that it wants to present itself as a tribute to the bravery of the servicemen without touching on the purpose of their work, really only begs the question, who do you think you're selling this to? Is there really a significant number of people out there with doubts about the US's invasion of Iraq that would be swayed by a look at the conflict solely through the eyes of Americans? Even if the casting of a who's who of fresh-faced young talent to fill out the ensemble did manage to get me on board with the idea that this team was entirely comprised of the nicest group of army boys ever seen, when Warfare asks me just to take everything that happens on screen at face value, I'm obviously going to shape it with my pre-existing understanding of the army and the war. I've no doubt that the shots of the team maneuvering through the war-torn streets in the dead of night are meant to highlight their professionalism and bravery, but my brain's screaming, you made it this way. I'm sure that seeing them all gathered around a mini laptop screen to watch Eric Pryd's Call on Me music video is meant to be a humanizing and relatable moment, where they try to detach themselves from the horrors of war. But all I can see is a heavily armed squad laughing and dancing with machine guns in hand, showing how little the devastation of a country and its people weigh on their conscience. I'd love for this to have been intentional, for Garland to actually be striving, however futilely, for an anti-war statement that actively makes you question the psychology towards warfare that countries like America encourage. But the straightforwardness of the presentation of everything, from the procedure to the ensuing chaos, only serves to valorize the SEALs in everything they do, while begging you not to think about what motivates them. It's a tough balancing act, juxtaposing a cute story of developing love and kinship with a backdrop of fascist social upheaval. Even The Sound of Music, after about 2 hours of musical romantic comedy, really feels rather abrupt when the last hour or so diverts to Scarpa, the Nazis are here. It's something that really compels me to pick up Tom Michel's memoirs, on which this movie is based, to see exactly how he recounts this period of his life, saving and raising an adorable penguin, and living in such a tumultuous time and place. It goes away to explaining why there are fewer comedy hijinks than you'd usually expect from something with the summary cynical man adopts a penguin and learns to live again. A Jim Carrey film in particular comes to mind, instead adopting a more somber dramatic tone that had me convinced going into it that this was the latest from John Madden or Stephen Frears. The Penguin Lessons mostly tries to tether the disparate elements together through a theme of rejecting apathy, a general thesis of "'tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." The absolutely precious penguin, named Juan Salvador, covers this on the emotional baseline, so to speak, filling a hole in Michel's life created by personal tragedy that led him to a wayward, lonely existence. The more this aspect of his life is filled, through caring for Juan Salvador and letting the staff and students at the private school he works at into his life through the shared adoration of the penguin, the more the fires of resistance and defiance are stoked in the face of an oppressive regime. Particularly when a young girl he connects with is kidnapped by authorities in front of him in broad daylight. After a period of looking the other way in cowardice, he proceeds to voice his protests to authorities, take an active part in the lives of those around him, and take an unorthodox but motivated direction in connecting with his students, both in making them care about the subject he's teaching and quelling the bullying going on in the classroom, spurred by the different political allegiances of the parents, by referring to the political elements in the poetry he presents to them. Incidentally, it's nice to hear the words socialist and fascist actually being used to label vastly opposing ideologies and groups. The suddenness of the ending may be just a faithful adaptation of the memoirs. After all, this isn't the fictional story of how a man and a penguin overthrew a dictatorship. Much of what Michel experienced carried on beyond the period of his life recounted here. All the same, it can feel like a bit of a backtrack of the thematic connections drawn across the narrative, and maybe could have done with fleshing out the conclusion with just a scene or two more. Still, Steve Coogan anchors the film wonderfully with a reserved but charming performance as Michel. Combined with how little that penguin has to try to make you fall in love with him, The Penguin Lessons manages to feel like it would have to go out of its way not to be emotionally arresting.